Christmas brunch. 11:15 a.m. The dining room looked like something out of a luxury catalog. Crystal glasses, white candles, silver pine cones perfectly arranged in a line down the middle of the long mahogany table. My sister Olivia stood at the head floor-length red velvet gown, pearls gleaming, holding her wine glass like royalty. To family, she said, smiling wide. People clinked glasses. Laughter floated through the air like soft bells. Then she glanced sideways, her voice dropping just enough to slice. Not fake family, not the ones we just picked up along the way. The laughter that followed wasn't loud, but it was sharp. Knowing. Practiced. I felt it like a knife to the throat. My hands tightened around my napkin. I looked down. I was seated at the side table again. The folding chair dug into my back, while my cousin's 5-year-old spilled orange juice next to me. 3rd year in a row. She didn't say my name. She never did. She didn't have to. I was the only adopted one. The only one who didn't look like the others in the Christmas photos that filled the walls. The only one whose name was missing from the custom ornaments she handed out that morning, gold lettering on red satin, Olivia James Leah. None for me. Again. I watched her take a sip of champagne, then look past me like I wasn't even part of the air. It didn't matter that I'd stayed behind to care for Mom during her chemo, or that I'd paid the mortgage on the house when Dad lost his job, or that I was the one who'd arranged this very brunch, booked the caterers, lit every candle. To her, I was still just picked up. A flicker of heat rose behind my ribs. But I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I just reached into my coat pocket and texted one word. Now. Across town, a door opened. Boots stepped forward. And 30 seconds later, the air in that perfect dining room would change forever. But she didn't know that yet. She was too busy laughing and calling me fake. I was adopted at age 13. Hannah never let me forget it, not once, not even in silence. It wasn't the loud things she said, but the quiet choices, the repeated exclusions, the way she polished the picture of family to make sure I was never part of the frame. Every year, the same rituals holiday cards went out with perfectly posed photos, her kids on the front lawn in matching sweaters, Mom and Dad behind them, Olivia beside her husband, and always the tagline, "From all of us." But there was never an us that included me. My face never made the mantle. Not in frames, not in magnets on the fridge, not even in the digital slideshows that played during family events. When I asked once, just once, if there was a copy of the beach photo we all took at Myrtle Beach, she smiled and said, "Oh, that one didn't turn out great? You were squinting." But the photo hung in her hallway for years. I wasn't squinting. I was standing in the back, almost out of frame. And maybe that was the problem. I had dared to be visible. My name was missing from everything that was meant to say together. The group texts, I found out I wasn't in the main thread when someone accidentally texted me thinking I was already looped in. I wasn't. Again. There was always a second layer of communication, a quiet circle where the real decisions got made. Birthdays, holidays, Sunday brunch plans, they were passed around in that digital living room I never got the key to. Once I found out about our parents' 35th anniversary party through Facebook, someone had tagged a photo of the cake. When I showed up anyway, dressed in navy and holding flowers, Hannah raised her eyebrows like I'd walked into the wrong house. "Oh, you came," she said, forcing a smile, eyes darting toward the caterer. Not a single seat was saved for me. I ended up helping in the kitchen. Even after I graduated from college summa cum laude, even after I got my own job, bought a little starter home in Portland, started mentoring foster kids. I was still the outsider they tried to include. But inclusion was conditional. I had to laugh at their jokes. I had to excuse the comments. I had to pretend that love was offered without conditions when it was actually weighed, measured, and rationed out like wartime sugar. My place in the family always had an asterisk. She called me half-sister in introductions. "This is my adopted sister Clara," she'd say, as if the word sister might stain her mouth if she didn't pad it with a disclaimer. At first I told myself she didn't mean anything by it. But then came the wedding. Not mine, hers. I wasn't in the bridal party, not even as a backup bridesmaid. I handed out programs. When she gave her speech, she thanked Olivia for always being like a second mom and called our brother Josh her first best friend. Then she looked at me, Det, I swear she did, and said some of us are just lucky enough to be born into love. People clapped. I smiled. But inside, I broke just a little more. That was the year I stopped calling just to check in. That was the year I let the birthday card I always sent get lost in the mail. That was the year I started buying myself a cupcake on my birthday because I knew no one else would. They called me distant, said I was hard to connect with. But distance wasn't something I created. It was a place I'd been put over and over like a forgotten jacket in the closet, never quite thrown away, but never worn proudly either. The final crack came the day my father had a heart scare. Hannah texted everyone but me. I found out 2 days later from Josh. I drove 7 hours straight, parked outside the hospital, and walked in with coffee and a quiet prayer. Hannah saw me, blinked, then said, "Wow, I didn't think you'd come all this way." I stood there, coffee in hand, no words left. She'd stripped every title from me, sister, daughter, family, until all I had left was my own breath and the memory of the day I first arrived 13 years old, 2 garbage bags filled with clothes, and a look in my eyes that said, "Don't leave me behind again." But they had. Not in a single dramatic moment, but in hundreds of tiny ones. The empty chair at Christmas, the missing name on a gift tag, the family group photo where I was the one taking the picture, not in it. I had carried that ache quietly. I tried to earn something that should have never needed earning, and somewhere along the way, I stopped asking to be chosen. But just because I'd gone silent didn't mean I'd gone soft. I didn't need their table to eat. I didn't need their photo to be real. And if they ever tried to erase me again, they were going to learn something they'd refused to see all along. I had built something bigger than their approval. I had a life they didn't know about. And one day, when they least expected it, they would see exactly what kind of love they threw away. Because I was no longer just the girl they adopted. I was the woman someone else chose to call mom. A boy who didn't share my blood, but carried my last name. A young man they hadn't met yet. But they would. I stopped waiting for a seat at their table. At some point, the hunger for belonging becomes a different kind of hunger. One that doesn't beg to be fed, but learns how to cook alone. So I built my own table plank by plank, with time, with stillness, with the unspoken decision that I would no longer measure my worth in the eyes of people who looked right past me. At 27, I adopted a boy named Marcus. He was 16 when he arrived at my door, shoulders tight like a soldier in the wrong war, his backpack half-zipped, and his silence even tighter. His caseworker told me not to expect too much. "He's had 4 placements," she said. "Doesn't trust easily. Probably won't stay." I nodded, but inside I knew he didn't have to trust me yet. I just had to stay still long enough to prove I wouldn't leave. I didn't give speeches. I didn't throw parties or take first-day selfies. I just kept showing up. Hot meals, 2 towels folded on the bathroom rack, a door that stayed unlocked, a light left on. The first time he let out a full laugh, it was because I burned a frozen pizza and called it rustic. The first time he called me Mom, it wasn't dramatic. We were running late for a dentist appointment, and he yelled from the other room, "Hey Mom, can you hand me my shoes?" I didn't correct him. I didn't make it a moment. I just handed him the shoes, smiled to myself, and memorized the sound. He taught me patience in ways I didn't know I still needed. I taught him how to hold a hammer, how to write a college essay, how to sit through a silent dinner without assuming it meant something was wrong. When he failed a math test, I didn't scold. I sat beside him until we both understood it. When he got into a fight at school, I didn't shame him. I asked what hurt so bad that his fists had to speak. At night, I'd check on him like clockwork, and more nights than not, I'd find him asleep with a book cracked open on his chest. When he got his driver's license, he grinned like it was the first thing he'd ever earned with both hands. And then came the morning he told me he'd enlisted. I didn't see it coming. He left a note on my pillow folded twice. It said, "You taught me what family means. I'll make you proud." I sat on the edge of the bed for hours, rereading that line like it was scripture. I hadn't raised him to be a soldier. I had raised him to be whole, but maybe in the wholeness, he found something worth protecting. The Navy took him in, and for a while letters were all we had, some handwritten, some typed. He never wrote about missions, just small things. His favorite part of the ship, a stray cat that lingered by the mess hall, a guy in his unit who reminded him of our neighbor Mr. Evans. He'd sign every letter, "Your son, always." And I'd sit at the kitchen table holding those letters like lifelines. Meanwhile, back home, the family continued without noticing what I'd built. Hannah never asked about Marcus, not once. At Thanksgiving, someone mentioned in passing, "I think Clara took in a kid, right?" And she waved it off with, "Yeah, she always had that charity streak." Charity. That word made me flinch, not because it was cruel, but because it was so small. What I did wasn't charity. It was legacy. Marcus didn't need rescuing. He needed roots. And I had planted them in every dinner, every repaired doorknob, every quiet night when I didn't ask questions. I just stayed. And now that root system had spread beyond me. He wasn't a boy anymore. He was a man. And the world would meet him soon. But not yet. I wasn't planning a moment. I wasn't plotting revenge. I was just living. Quietly. Honestly. Fully. And in doing so, I was building a life that spoke for itself. No need to explain. No need to defend. Just truth steadily growing in the background, like ivy, slow but unshakable. Marcus didn't know about the exclusion I'd lived through. He didn't know the depth of the silence I'd been handed at birthdays, or how many family group chats my name had never entered. He didn't know that every year I watched their photo albums update like I'd never been born. I never told him. I didn't want his love to grow in the soil of my bitterness. I wanted him to bloom in something cleaner, freer. So I never said a word. I just packed care boxes with his favorite cereal. I marked his letters with, "Proud of you, always." I attended every family function alone, sat at the side tables, pretended not to notice the seating chart, pretended not to notice when they introduced Olivia's husband as their real son-in-law, and skipped my name altogether. I let it roll off not because I was numb, but because I no longer needed their recognition to know who I was. They'd erased me from the pictures. That was fine. I was raising a man who'd one day walk in and make the whole room pause. They didn't see it coming. But I did. Back to the brunch. The table was heavy with tradition white linens, rosemary place cards, mimosas that tasted more like ritual than refreshment. Hannah stood at the center, performing for the extended family like she always had. Her voice carried just the right volume to dominate but not disturb. She was showing off her daughter's college acceptance letters, now carefully fanned out like a hand of royal flushes. Brown, Stanford, Yale. The room gasped in practiced awe forks, clinking against porcelain, the air rich with approval. I sat near the end again next to the kids' table. Actually, though no one had officially told me I was supposed to be there, I just knew. The folding chair beneath me wobbled slightly every time I shifted my weight, like even the furniture knew I didn't belong. One of the cousins leaned across their plate and asked casually if I'd be joining the family reunion next summer. Their tone was polite, barely interested, but the question still hung in the air. That's when Hannah, still swirling her wine like it was part of a performance, laughed softly and said, "Well, technically, she's not really family." Just like that. No warning, no smirk to soften the blow. Her voice was bright and clipped, like she thought the line would land as comedy. A few chuckled. Some blinked in silence. Mom looked down, pretending to cut into a croissant she hadn't touched. My throat tightened not from surprise, but from familiarity. I'd heard that tone before. In hallway whispers. In the way invitations never came addressed to us. I could feel the old ache rising, the one that begged me to stand, to speak, to prove something. I almost stood up. Almost. But then the front door opened. No knock, no warning. Just the sound of boots against the hardwood floor. A few heads turned. At first, all we saw were the boots polished precise, like they walked differently than ours. Then the rest of him emerged. Marcus, my son, in full Navy SEAL dress uniform, his posture straight, chest broad, rows of medals gleaming against the deep blue, his hair trimmed close, his face calm but unreadable. Silence fell so quickly, it felt rehearsed. Hannah froze mid-sip wine glass tilted like a question. I didn't breathe. Marcus didn't smile. He just scanned the room slowly as if assessing the landscape. Then he walked forward, each step deliberate, letting the weight of his presence sink into the floorboards. And when he reached my side, he stopped. Every pair of eyes followed him. "Excuse me," he said clearly. His voice was quiet, but undeniable. "Is this seat taken?" He gestured to the empty chair beside me, the one no one had offered, the one I had pulled out for myself without asking. My mouth parted, but before I could answer, he continued. "I flew 14 hours to surprise my mom," he said. "Didn't realize it'd be in a room full of strangers." A few relatives shifted uncomfortably. Hannah's husband coughed into his napkin, but Marcus wasn't finished. He turned his body slightly enough so that they could all see the name on his uniform, the insignia of a SEAL, the evidence of a life earned, not gifted. "I just wanted to thank her," he said, voice unwavering, "for choosing me when no one else would, for showing me what family actually means." My heart beat so loud I thought it would drown him out, but he kept speaking steady as any commander. It wasn't biology that made her my mother. It was every hard day she stayed, every quiet night she listened, every time she believed in me when I gave her nothing to work with. Someone, maybe Aunt Janice, muttered. We didn't know, but Marcus looked directly at her. "That's the thing about family," he said. "You'd know if you paid attention." I felt heat rise behind my eyes, not from sadness, from recognition. For the first time in decades, I was being seen not through the lens of my absence, but through the legacy I had quietly built. Marcus placed his hand on my shoulder, grounding me. "Mom," he said, soft again, meant only for me. "You ready to go?" I nodded, still unable to speak. He turned to the room one last time. "Happy holidays," he said, "to the ones who show up." And with that, we left. We didn't. He walked straight to me. No hesitation, no glancing around the room for approval. Just calm, measured steps, boot soles firm against the polished hardwood, his presence like a dropped pin in a cathedral. He stopped 2 feet in front of me, then saluted. Sharp, clean. Not for show, but for me. For what I'd given him when no one else thought he was worth the effort. Then slowly he turned his head and looked directly at Hannah. The room might as well have disappeared. His words came low and controlled, but each syllable landed like thunder. "I heard what you said," he began. No anger. Just the gravity of someone who knew exactly what silence had cost. Funny how people confuse blood with loyalty. A sharp inhale from the far end of the table. My aunt's fork slipped and clattered onto her plate, but no one moved to pick it up. Marcus didn't flinch. Instead, he turned to face the entire table, his frame squared his medals, catching the light like truth itself. "This woman," he said, gesturing toward me, raised me, believed in me, not because she had to, but because she chose to. She taught me how to fight without fists, lead without shouting, and love without conditions. She gave me more than a name. She gave me direction, structure, dignity. Every part of the man you see standing here was built in her kitchen, on her couch, in the quiet moments when the rest of the world gave up. A heavy pause. No one blinked. "If that's not family," he said, his voice steady, "then I don't want any part of yours." His words didn't rise in volume, but somehow they filled the room more than any shouting ever could. Silence stretched so long it felt biblical. Even the clock above the mantel seemed to stop ticking, as if time itself needed to witness this moment. Hannah's face had drained to the color of chalk. She opened her mouth slightly, as if to speak, but no words arrived. Her daughter, seated beside her with her Letterman jacket folded neatly over her lap, looked down and away, suddenly fascinated by the hem of her napkin. Nobody came to Hannah's defense, not this time. For the first time in years, there was no nervous laughter to cushion the cruelty. No polite deflections, no subject changes. Just the echo of Marcus's truth and the quiet collapse of all the versions of reality they'd curated to make themselves feel superior. Then from across the table, a voice faint but undeniable. "She's more family than any of us." It was my mother. Her voice barely a whisper, but somehow louder than anyone else's had been all afternoon. Her eyes, once so rehearsed in avoiding mine, met mine with something closer to peace than I'd ever seen on her face. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She just nodded slowly, like someone finally ready to admit they'd misjudged something too important to keep denying. That was when the spell broke. You could feel the room exhale. Not with relief, but with reality. A truth long buried now sat undeniable in the center of the table where the roast had been just moments ago. The woman they'd dismissed had been the one carrying legacy all along. And the boy they thought was not really one of us had just stood taller than anyone in the room. Marcus stepped closer to me, then softening just for me. "You okay?" he asked, voice quieter now, private. I nodded, the lump in my throat too large for words. He didn't need more than that. We turned toward the door. I didn't say goodbye. Neither did he. Because when you've finally spoken the truth out loud, there's no need to linger in a room that only learned to listen after it lost the chance to deserve you. As we reached the front hallway, I caught one final glimpse of Hannah, still seated, but slouched now, like someone who'd been stripped of every illusion she'd dressed herself in. I didn't hate her. I didn't need to. Some consequences don't require revenge, just revelation. And she'd just watched hers walk out the door, in a Navy SEAL uniform, shoulder to shoulder with the woman she'd spent years pretending wasn't real family. Behind us, the house remained still. But something had shifted. Not just for them, for me. For the first time, we didn't stay for dessert. Marcus and I left before the pie came out, before the small talk returned to weather and college plans, and how much property values had gone up that year. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't need to. The door clicked behind us with a quiet finality. Not angry, not rushed, just enough. The kind of closing you don't realize is permanent until months later, when nothing in you wants to go back. We didn't speak in the car for a while. The roads were still damp from last night's snow. Soft flakes drifted down again, barely clinging to the windshield before melting into quiet disappearance. Marcus tapped the side of his leg, a nervous habit he had from years ago, and I could tell something was on his mind. "You okay?" I asked, eyes still on the road. He nodded slowly, then reached into his coat and handed me a small square box. "I meant to give this to you tonight anyway, before the drama." I pulled over just past an old church and opened it with numb fingers. Inside was a photo frame, nothing fancy, just walnut trim, a soft matte finish. But the picture inside caught my breath. It was from the day he graduated Buds. He was still in full uniform, face smeared with exhaustion and pride. I had my arms around him, half crying, half laughing. Someone must have snapped it while we weren't looking. It wasn't posed. It was real. And on the back, in his familiar sharp handwriting, were the words, "This one goes on your mantle. No more missing pictures." I didn't say anything for a moment, just held it to my chest like a lifeline. "Thank you," I whispered, but even that didn't feel big enough. He shrugged, but his voice cracked just slightly when he said, "You're the reason I made it through. I just wanted to give you something no one could erase." Later that night, after I dropped him at the base for a debrief he couldn't tell me about, I went home. The house was quiet, still smelled like pine and clove from the candle I'd lit that morning. I stood in front of the mantel, still half decorated from the holiday, and took down the old frame that had once held the only group photo I'd ever been in. It had cracked 2 years ago during a movie, and I'd never replaced the glass. I placed Marcus's photo in the center, adjusted the angle slightly, and then stepped back. For once, it didn't feel like I was standing in someone else's story, waiting for a seat or a scrap of approval. I wasn't invisible. I wasn't an afterthought. I wasn't the girl they tried to include. I was a mother, a builder, a woman who had created her own version of belonging, not from what was handed to her, but from what she chose to give. I remembered how I used to sit at family gatherings laughing too loud, or offering to help too much, hoping someone would notice. I remembered the ache of being left off group texts, the sting of Hannah's backhanded comments, the emptiness of a birthday card signed with only a name. I used to think love had to be earned, that I had to soften myself to be accepted. But now, standing in a living room that smelled like cinnamon and strength, I understood something deeper. Real family isn't about blood. It's about presence. About who shows up not out of obligation, but out of choice. About who holds your hand, not when it's convenient, but when it's costly. Marcus didn't owe me loyalty. He wasn't tied to me by DNA or guilt or tradition. He chose me, over and over again. And that choice was the kind of love no label could contain. The next morning, I took a photo of the frame on the mantel and texted it to him with 3 words. "It's home now." He replied with just one, "Finally." In the weeks that followed, I got messages from a few family members, some polite, some curious, some pretending they hadn't heard what happened at brunch. I didn't respond, not out of spite, but because I didn't owe them explanations anymore. I didn't owe anyone proof of worth. I spent that energy on people who showed up with open arms, not measuring tape. That spring, Marcus came back for a short visit. We planted hydrangeas in the backyard and painted the spare room he still jokingly called his base camp. He helped fix the loose shutter out front and teased me about my terrible coffee. At night, we'd sit on the porch wrapped in mismatched blankets, watching the sky settle into stars. One night he asked, "Do you ever miss it, the big reunions, the big house full of noise?" I thought about it, then shook my head. "I used to miss the idea of it," I said. "But that was before I realized something better. I don't need to be invited anymore. I've already arrived." He smiled, leaned back in the old wooden chair and closed his eyes. "That's what you always said," he murmured. "Build the thing they never gave you." I looked out at the yard, small, quiet, ordinary, and felt something like peace wrap around me. Not loud, not grand, just steady. And that's how it stays. No fanfare, no revenge plotted in rage. Just a slow, quiet reclaiming. A picture on the mantel. A boy who became a man. A woman who stopped waiting to be chosen and chose herself instead. That's what home really is. Not a place you're handed, but a place you protect, build, and fill with people who see you even when others never did.